Hello, welcome to another episode of Tales and Tactics, Rules as Written. This is our show that gives tabletop games the book club treatment. Take a deep dive with us, and we're going to take a look at games you know, maybe you don't know, maybe you've never even heard of. I'm your host, Troy. Joining me is my co-host, as always, Max, and behind the scenes is our producer, Jay, with the audio. Today's episode is about a game that I feel doesn't get enough attention. Quadrant 13 by TooFatLardies. This is a company-level, specific, sci-fi wargame. It is one of detail, of simulation, sort of process-driven outcomes that give you this intimate look at a pretty big battle that's playing out between your sci-fi or fictional forces.
Yeah, I was going through this morning and just trying to get like a sense of the scope and the depth of it. It's interesting. It's a very system-oriented game, and it is a very dense system at that.
It is. Like, to talk more about its origin, it is directly derived from I Ain't Been Shot, Mom, another TooFatLardies title, or Charlie Don't Surf, another title by the TooFatLardies. Those all share the same DNA. However, they spin the yarn in a little bit of a different fashion, we'll say. I Ain't Been Shot, Mom is the originator of the Lardies brand, effectively, and that is a company-level World War II game. Charlie Don't Surf moves that to Vietnam, changing the axis of the conflict from one where it's a standing army versus another standing army to one where you're fighting irregulars. Quadrant 13 comes in and moves the timeline into the unknown future. So this can be used to depict anything from a near future, almost cyberpunk level technology, where the armies are still plausible and using tech that we can relate to, full on to being what you use for your epic models for 40K, to like way out there sci-fi where the technology alters gravity itself. You know what I'm saying?
An interesting point to tie it back to those other games that it's sort of drawing its lineage from is that in this book, they state that, well, one, it's not a skirmish game of any sort. It's definitely a company level using multiple platoons, but also that it doesn't simulate any form of asymmetrical warfare like Vietnam in Charlie Don't Surf, or they give the other example of like Afghanistan.
That's right. This is a game that is about effectively one professional army, professional to one degree or another, fighting another. And you get the tools, the DIY tool set to define your own factions, your own forces. And to be frank, the ask is a little high because you're not given a lot of guidance. You do have to go in and make your own forces here just out of the book without a lot of example.
It also has this issue in the fact that it's in a fictional setting. And so they repeatedly make the concern, even in the book, that you have to define a lot of these things before you set out to use it in whatever way you are, because we would know that there's a historical falling back when it comes to a game like Ain't Been Shot, Mum, or any of those other games that they've made that are historically set. In this case, you really have to pin it to something, and it could literally be anything, and there's no explicit setting given. So I think that's a problem with a lot of toolbox games, that it's not that it's bad, it's just that it's more work.
Yes, it is an upfront amount of work. So that's good to know as a player, that you will be defining your units, your army lists, your orders of battle. They even have a section on defining Chrome. So if you wanted to have a special rule that was an exception to how these very rules work, they'll talk you through how you can rationalize that and include that in your army list as sort of a rule break, so to speak. So there's a lot of potential in these rules. To give you some more background on them, they came out in November of 2012. So at time of recording now, they are 13 years old. So they've been around for a little bit of time, the Quadrant 13 rules. I think because of that barrier with having to define your own forces, it does make it a little bit harder to get into. And it wasn't until a TooFatLardies special that came out a couple years later where they introduced point values for Quadrant 13 that it became maybe a little easier to visualize doing a pickup game or how you might use this. But from where I stand after my experience with this game, having played it over these 13 years at different times with different sets of models, I feel that this is one of the best ways to do a sci-fi campaign, is using this as your tactical game engine, because it is just so open to so many potentials and so many different outcomes, and you can feed so much into it, and the game can handle it. There is, like, in very few games could you ever think of there being a reason to have an engineering vehicle.
Yeah.
Like, that's so often not necessary. But in Quadrant 13, there are times where even that feels like it could have a place, especially in a campaign context. And fortunately, you're given all of the rules to define that unit. So it's really robust. To walk you through how the game works fundamentally, this will be familiar to anyone who has a background with some of these classic Lardies card-driven games, but it is a card-driven or chit draw game, depending how you play it. And you would have one card that ends the turn, and that is in the deck. And then the rest of the deck is comprised of the different platoons that you're fielding and the, quote, big men, the command characters that make up your leadership. And they're all shuffled together into this deck. And as you play a turn, you just take the top card, flip it over, and that is the next activation. So there's this real flow, sequence of events that you can even backtrack through if you need to by just looking at the cards and seeing what happened. But there's this real flow, this progression, this event after event that leads to the next event, which consequently leads to the next event, that really kind of feels simulative of something breaking down into these various steps and stages, as opposed to something really gamified and sequency, where it's like, this is my sequence of play, and now this is your sequence of play. With this card deck, it's very organic, and you just get the activation order that you get. There's no ability for you as a player to interject on that.
Those card systems are interesting. They take a little bit of getting used to if you're expecting more control over what happens. But when you look at the events as they've played out, there is this, I don't know if I can call it a natural quality exactly, but there are these turns that shift the battle quite a bit. And you do get a sense of, like, I don't know exactly how to explain it. I was less opposed to it after trying it than before.
It's true. It is a bit of a paradigm shift. It is something you have to become comfortable with, because your role as the player changes a bit. You are more reactive than you are someone with great agency, because you're not going to define, like, I'm first doing this and now I am doing that. This is my movement for the turn. You more have to ride what you're given, and it's about exploiting opportunity and creating events that suit you by the turn order that you're given, less you being able to consistently execute on a plan of your own invention. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. Just a word about the book itself. You gave me a PDF copy of this, but as far as like the way that this works, it's pretty good. It has a nice 2-column breakdown. It has good full color pictures of miniatures. The weird bordering is, I don't say, it's very early 2000s looking, and I'm not a huge fan of it, but it's not that distracting.
Very sci-fi looking, right?
Yeah, but like of a particular era of sci-fi. Something about the quality of this in the cover and the font and all this reminds me of like early like D20 supplement, like third-party supplements.
Okay.
There's a strange sort of like for instance, they use like this really basic embossing on the word 13, and on like even on Quadrant 13, even goes as far as putting it into like rules for command size actions in a science fiction universe. And then they use a more outlined font for like tablet edition. I'm not a super fan of this type of look, but it's not so overbearing that it actually makes the book like unpleasant. I think the only fear I would have is that for me personally, if I saw a book actually sitting like with this cover, I might avoid it because it looks a little amateurish, which maybe for the time that it was made, I think that may have made more sense or been more appropriate. But the other thing that is nice about this tablet edition is that it's well placed for having quick link, like hyperlinks to different pages, including the index throughout the entire book. I think it's one of the better layouts for this because very often you'll have a hyperlink index, but what I always want is at least a link back to the index on each page.
Right.
This actually does it. It's a little bit like oversized for my feeling, but you wouldn't miss it. So I guess the only other criticism I have is that whatever font they're using is really brittle looking. I'm definitely seeing this at 100% scale on my screen right now. And it looks like impact font, but with a bit more of a sci-fi edge. I always find sci-fi fonts to be a little hard to read when scaled to like a body font. It doesn't make this hard. Like it's by no means is it a bad read. It's some kind of slightly sci-fi-ish looking sans serif font. It's just some of the parts of it are really thin and it kind of makes my eyes strain a bit. But other than that, like the layout is super clean, modern, everything about it makes it sound like I'm dumping on the layout of this book. There's just something kind of anachronistic about the layout. Or not the layout, pardon me, the style.
I would describe it as a very direct to PDF delivery.
Yeah.
And that is something that, like, you know, perhaps that's the nature of this product, but I do feel that this is sort of a bit of a gem that's easy to overlook because of that.
I think that this I don't know that it'll sell better, but it might present better if it had a relayout, where some of the stylized elements were a bit more subtle. The tables are all sorts of colors and sizes, which is a little bit straining. But like the diagrams for card draws look really great. So like it may be more like a consistency thing. It doesn't look unprofessional, but it sort of looks semi-professional.
And to clarify, it's written by Robert Avery, a friend of Lardies. So it's not a mainline Lardies product. And I think that's something we're picking up on with that. But with what you get,
getting past that, yeah,
you get probably one of the most satisfying sci-fi or hard sci-fi, we'll clarify, rule sets around. It definitely says in the opening body in the letter to the reader by the author, this is a harder science fiction, more realistic, rooted in historical principles, as opposed to something that is based in the tradition of sci-fi wargaming, right? So there's kind of like when you're playing a game, I should clarify, this is a 6 mil to 15 mil style sci-fi game, so firmly in the epic category. When you're playing epic, there's certain assumptions, you know, about the scale, like huge blobs of units that move across, giant walkers. Like there's these certain concepts that they've kind of baked in to our preconceived notions of what epic scale gaming is. And a lot of that is not present in the same way in Quadrant 13. It certainly can be manifested in this game through the do-it-yourself rules approach. However, there are some nods to like reality. Like, for example, there are spotting rules in this game for spotting units that are hiding. And for walkers, they're penalized if they're really tall. So those big walking mechs that are so common to your classic epic scale science fiction gaming, right? Like your Titans and the like, they're actually kind of penalized in this game because you can spot them a mile away and just start blasting. So it's got some reality underscoring it that is very satisfying if that's what you're looking for. And what it will provide is sort of a systems heavy, of course, but a systems driven approach to resolving this beat by beat by beat fight, you know, at the company level. So you're looking at controlling between 3 to 9 platoons at the upper end. So probably about 4 to 6 platoons most of the time. Maybe a couple extra big men mixed in, you know, 1 per platoon probably, and maybe 1 or 2 extras. Half your platoons are infantry, half them are vehicles most likely. So you're looking at like, say, 3 to 6 tanks on the table, 6 to 9 infantry squads. And at this point, you've got a real game on your hands. And how you represent an infantry squad is it's actually pretty flexible. You can have them individually based and just take off casualties. You can have them multi-based on team bases or on a big section base and just mark casualties on the base with rings or with, like cardboard casualty chit markers or whatever you have from a board game or something.
Right.
Whatever you want to do. But the squad is the squad is the squad. They kind of operate as one thing. There are contexts which they can break down into smaller groups, but it's not really a predominant feature of the rules. It's like fire teams aren't a thing, squads are a thing, and we operate at the platoon level. We activate a platoon, and then all of its elements, like the squads or the separate vehicles, all now act, doing their own separate little thing. We go back again to that card deck, and we'll draw the next card. And then that element will activate, and its elements will pop, 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 do their thing. When you draw a big man card out of the deck, that becomes very familiar to us who play more modern Lardies games, because that's like a junior or senior leader in Chain of Command, or a character, or a leader in Sharp Practice.
Yeah.
Because they'll have a certain number of initiatives that they can spend to activate units before their card has been drawn as a unit activation. So they don't allow you to double activate someone, but they allow you to get someone out of sequence. And also you can remove shock with their orders as well, or their initiatives, in addition to doing things like calling in artillery and mortar fire. So they're very flexible and very important, but they are backed up by the fact that the units themselves have their own activation card, which kind of represents like the NCOs and the leadership and the planning of the units themselves, that can at least operate with some autonomy. They don't need like a leader to direct every step of the way.
Mm-hmm.
But the leader is what will keep them going when things start to fall apart.
Right. Yeah. Technology level is an interesting concept.
That's a really good point. Yeah, there are different tech levels in this game if you want to talk more about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is TL is not an unfamiliar thing in both. Probably, I see it more in role-playing games than in war games, but certainly in sci-fi war games, if they have the scope of usually hard sci-fi levels, they tend to fall into that instead of a more romantic setting like 40K or something of that nature, where you could frame it in that way, but it doesn't quite match up.
Yeah.
So in this, there are 5, starting from 0 and going up to 4. And for them, or for this designer, tech level 0 is basically now, or before now, I guess. We would be at the end of tech level 0 or somewhere entering into the first tech level, at the beginning of the first and the end of the 0 level. It's essentially anything prior to later 20th century technology is what they're saying. So I guess by their definition, we are in tech level 1.
Yeah.
Tech level 1 is, I think it could include like much more technologically advanced things, but it is sort of like the precursor to like AI on the battlefield, or, fully autonomous soldiers and things like this.
Like smart tech, but not autonomous tech, right?
Yeah, exactly. Tech level 2, so this is where they describe things like beam weapons, smart missiles, drones, alternative power sources, which I assume they mean like something higher than fissional nuclear power.
Right.
And then like limited abilities to control like gravitational fields and create force fields. The parallels they give are, and this is kind of an odd one, are Red Dwarf and Terminator.
Okay.
Red Dwarf is an odd thing to draw a comparison to as to what technology level it actually exists in.
You can tell it's British.
Yeah, well, I mean, so it's showing its national allegiance or bias, for sure. Terminator, also kind of an odd pick, but not as odd as their example for tech level 3. It's similar to tech level 2, except that space travel is much more like obvious and there's more effective force fields. Computers are seemingly as advanced as human beings. So I guess there's something equivalent to true AI. But the example given is Star Wars.
Yeah.
Which is an odd analog because it's more of a pulp fantasy sci-fi setting.
I think they're trying to talk more about the X-Wings half of Star Wars, like that kind of like...
Sure, the military tech aspect of it. Yeah.
Yeah, but you're right though. Like that's only an element of Star Wars, which is more like, pulp fiction.
I can glean from that the vibe. So I'm not saying that that's wrong.
Yeah,
but it does raise all sorts of like, because there isn't much else said about it except through the examples in the book of what qualifies as this.
Yeah, true.
Which probably will give you a clearer view. And then tech level 4 is the absolute pinnacle, and it's basically Star Trek.
Yeah, Eldar or Star Trek.
Yeah, exactly. He also lists I think it's sci-fi series of, Line of Polity?
Oh, okay.
Which I'm not that familiar with.
No, me neither.
Neil Asher, who I've heard of, but yeah. I think it's like distant sci-fi. So I would assume it's equivalent to Star Trek in some respects. And there's some interesting elements that kind of get into the disparities between those technologies, and that certain actions or abilities with certain units are limited by their tech level. So the higher the tech level, the more flexibility you have in what you can do.
And in many abilities that you're familiar with from I Ain't Been Shot or Charlie Don't Surf actually get a modifier to this based on your tech level. So those games are kind of assuming a tech level 0, right? But in this, you'll get a +3 if you're a tech level 3 to your spotting attempts if you're using your technology, right? So it's like allowing the tech level to influence the reliability that certain units have. And it can change and be used in different ways, as you'll see. Like the tech level can even be the armor save value. So this is another point we might make about this game. There's sort of a different system for everything,
Yeah, it would fall under the term that at least our group uses, which is clufty.
Yes, where it's like for every way that you would resolve a different thing or a different action or verb, there's a different consequential set of dice rolls for that. For armor saves, it's your tech level ×2, roll 2d6 under that value, equal to or under that value, and you block the kill and convert it to a point of shock or morale damage. And that's really cool, and I really love that your tech level influences the quality of your armor. It's an elegant way to incorporate that. It's just 2d6 roll low never appears again in this game. It's just that sort of, there's that type of feel to a lot of the mechanics in that they'll actually do a really good job of resolving the specific thing they're there to resolve. It's just that nothing else will work like that. So it'll require a certain quick reference or familiarity with the rules that you will get. But it's something that I guess is a bit of a holdback though, because like when you want to shoot at infantry, you're using the fire table, which is a combat resolution table. When you want to fight a tank, you're using the shooting at a tank table for firing at the vehicles, right? If you want to use artillery, well, if it's preliminary bombardment, it works one way. If it's indirect fire on table, it's one way. Indirect fire off table is another way. So there's always these different things to think about that do kind of put a lot on the mind of the player. But it's really interesting because you get to define how much of that you're going to engage with almost in the way you write your army lists, because that defines what's at play, like what's going to be in your game.
Yeah, I mean, so like a system or a rule set being clufty is not necessarily a bad thing. It could mean that the mechanics resolve in a very like specifically considered way.
Yes, and it seems to be that is 9 out of 10 the case with this, where the mechanical...
It's not always the case, to be fair, like with other games. Like in the sense that sometimes the designer has not the most unified or straightforward mindset. And again, unified system, it's just because a system is unified doesn't make it good either, just on its onset. So I just thought I'd point that out.
No, that's true. And One of the things that I really enjoy about this system, though, is the way that each element is so well considered for what it's doing. Like how activation works, as we've talked about it off the card, right? Well, when you pick a unit, a squad, or an individual vehicle, they get a number of actions equal to their quality level and the current amount of damage they've taken. Damage being casualties, effectively. Vehicles take other forms of damage, but when a squad is activated, it would get typically about 3 actions. If it's taken losses, it could go down as low as 2 to 1 actions, even running out of actions, and effectively be becoming inert. And how these actions work is they kind of equate to a die, a d6. So I spend 2 actions on movement. I roll 2d6. That is my movement. So it translates really logically what you're doing. And how shooting works against a soft skin vehicle like a truck or something, or an infantry target or a support weapon, is you just roll however many action dice you assign to it. So you just roll your, 1 to 3, sometimes 4 if you've got veterans or something. And you roll that, and you consult the combat resolution table, the CRT, called the fire table. And that is actually a really clever system because it's not a set of hard, fast rules. This is more of an umpire thing that you get from earlier Lardies rules, where they assume the presence of a third party that's helping you manage and run the game between the players. You don't need that, obviously, but it is something that is sort of nice because in this table, you'll see that there is close, effective, long range for infantry and then close and effective for vehicles and support weapons. But you're going to grade your shot as great, okay, or poor. And that's going to determine when you roll your fistful of action dice, where it falls. And you'll reference, I rolled 3 action dice. I got 8 on my dice score total, so I didn't roll great. But I got an 8, and I look over, it's a poor shot, unfortunately, because they're in hard cover. And it's at effective range, so I don't do very well. But it will tell you how many hits you do, or if you do any special morale damage, like pinning or suppression.
I mean, you have more experience with the system than I do, but like from its onset, it seems rewarding in that sort of moment-to-moment kind of action.
The action dice are like chunky handles to play with your squads and vehicles.
Yeah. But it will take some framing to kind of get your head past the learning phase of the rules to then start enjoying that moment. Because that's always the difficulty with something that's more crunchy, is naturalizing yourself to the rule system so that you can eventually see through it. You got to see through the code of the matrix.
Yeah.
And then you're enjoying the game in its moment-to-moment action. Otherwise, you don't know. Like, I mean, I think this is true of any game. This is true of board games the first time you pick them up, especially if they have a certain level of complexity. Yeah. You don't really know what it is that is going or what's an optimal choice. You're kind of just making arbitrary decisions and seeing what happens. And then hopefully by the end of it, you would have grasped it. I don't like how long would you say it would take to kind of get into the proper frame?
See, that's where it's hard because I've been playing this game on and off since it came out. It's one of the earlier Lardy games I adopted. I've played it with Spartan miniatures way back in the day. So those were 6mm epic alikes. I've played with 6mm and 15mm Quar. And most recently now, I've played with the new epic scale Legions Imperialis, which is what I just used for this last game. And it's worked with all of them. I haven't had a problem with any of that. I find the difficulty, though, is in trying to manage like all of the potential things you can do and the way that it explains it to covering all of those potentialities. It's like, yes, you can do anything, but can you find where in the rules they specifically tell you how to do that and explain it out to you? And in the indexing is good and the rules are well written from a technical perspective, but they're just so dense that it's easy to miss in a page of things that are already important facts, just one of the important facts that you should know in your army list construction. That is the hardest part of this game, I feel like, is getting to grips with it and getting into that headspace through actually being able to play it by being able to assemble the parts. And it's also tough because if you've never played it, How do you know what a good tank is? So when you're assembling a tank, it's like, is this a good tank? They give you starter values, they give you some information. And again, if you're coming from I Ain't Been Shot Mum or Charlie Don't Surf, you probably understand, like, oh, okay, I know what a tank like this should have. It should be armor value 5. Maybe you'll know that instinctively, just by your previous experience. But it doesn't help you with a lot of that. Now that I've kind of gotten a lot more comfortable at writing rules on my own, through my personal experiences, and I've gotten a lot more comfortable hacking game systems apart, and even playing other games like Laser Storm, like another sort of adjacent sci-fi epic scale game where you have to write your own lists, right?
Yeah.
You kind of get more familiar with like what the ask is and what you want your stuff to be. And it's almost like you and your brain start to think about your collection, not in terms of the specific numbers of a game, but in terms of its like job it's supposed to be. So like a Predator battle tank in Legion Imperialis has a Predator battle cannon, heavy bolters, and very specific Games Workshop-y things. And then if you put that into Laser Storm, now it has a main gun that works like this and secondary guns that work like this. And then in Quadrant 13, it's got a direct fire boom weapon, and now it has direct fire auto guns, right? Just that's how the terminology this game will use. But you kind of have to get used to the idea that the thing is not the specific parts of it, it's the role that it occupies. And then you slot that into the rule set by figuring out how does that rule set accommodate this role of medium battle tank or assault transport. And then you make that how you look at the units, not like, okay, this thing has 4 last cannons, so how do I make 4 last cannons? It's like, that's not what you're doing.
Right.
You're thinking, this is an assault transport, how do I make an assault transport? And once you kind of can get to grips with the actual process of making your units, which took me a little bit of time, I have to admit, like it was hard to, like if you want to make a World War II alike force, like the Quar, that'll take you no time at all. You'll just get through that in a blink. And there used to be published army lists. I'm not sure if they're still up for some stuff, including the Quar, and other different popular manufacturers of the time when this came out. So there were ways to get inspiration for lists, but a lot of it kind of came down to you, the gamer, you, the player, defining it yourself. Once you have made your units, though, the game it's got good bones. I mean, it's based on a very popular and very successful World War II engine, and it just takes it and ups the lethality a bit, uncorks some of the powers, makes air power a much more prominent part of the game. Like you can have jetpacks, you can have flying wings, you can have all types of different modes of flight that'll really impact the game. And it's kind of shocking at first because it's like a guy with a jetpack can fly kind of anywhere. It's not like a 6-inch jump, but it's weird though, because they have to take flight and then they have to prepare to land. Because if you don't prepare, he makes a good point. What's it called when you fail to prepare to land? It's called a crash landing. So it's like, okay, I guess you're right. I guess you are right. So you can't just fly around and then smoke the roof of a building like and start gunfighting. It's like you need to prepare to come down. You need to prepare a descent. So it's got some interesting conceits, the way that it wrangles certain concepts. But if you've played the inspiration points for this, it'll come quite naturally. And if you haven't, then the challenge will become getting a force list you're comfortable with and getting it to table. But for a lot of us who have played these epic scale sci-fi games, we're used to asks of like 40, 50 bases per side, like big armies. And this game is more literal about the number of men per stand than it is, meeting a minimum stand count, like an equivalent epic game, right? In this, you need, between 6 to 10 guys to be a squad. So if your base is 2 Legion Imperialis bases, each with 5 men on them, that's a 10-man squad. That's 2 little bases. So all of a sudden, that's 18 of those bases is 9 squads. That's a whole company right there. And that's just 18 of those bases. They're little, with little guys on them. Mm-hmm. That's a fast paint.
Yeah.
That's a fast paint. That's not a huge ask. So this game also allows you to play an epic scale sci-fi fight without a massive investiture in models to even like break the ceiling, to get the minimum number to get on the table with, right? Not that there's like a lot of terrible culprits for that other than the big obvious one like Epic Warpath, Legion Imperialis. Those games are much more focused, even though Epic Warpath's brand new, I don't know a ton about it, but they are more focused on the traditional, like getting a lot of guys on the table to depict a big old mashup.
Mass scale, yeah.
Yeah, and I think what's cool about this is there's more of a nod towards a realistic dispersal between your units. You know, you're not shoulder to shoulder in the same way that you might be in some other games. Because if you would be, like, the enemy, if you're mixed up with the enemy, if you're mixed up with a friendly and the enemy is now targeting you, they get a +2 to their fire result, and they get to apply the morale result to both targets. So if you roll a 7, you get to modify your roll with the +2, so maybe now it's higher. And if it was a pinning, both those targets get the pin. So it's like you have to disperse, you have to spread out, you have to think about it outside of the terms of me just being like, I'm a power armor commander, I'm going to run forward and power armor you in the face. That isn't enough. And I think that's very satisfying. It's a game where elite units are elite, sure, but they're more elite when you pilot them with what that enables you to do rather than them just being inherently super tough, awesome guys.
It's more of like a combined arms game as opposed to a superhero throwdown.
Yes.
Yeah, just having like an amazing unit does not ensure that unit is necessarily more survivable nor more useful. It's more about playing the broader strategy. And I think that really plays to the idea that it's more of a hard SF game. I think we were talking about this a bit before we started recording, but the idea that hard SF and say like softer or more like romanticized SF, they can mechanically be represented differently.
Yes.
And this game certainly leans more in that direction of it being more like military forces rather than, and I don't want to be too disparaging of people who enjoy playing Warhammer 40K if it like 10th edition or anything like that, but that game feels more like a WWE like throwdown match with other guys.
Yeah, it does. That's so good.
And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that if you think it's fun. But it's nice to see that there's a broader range of tabletop tactical games that are sci-fi based. Again, I still think the tricky thing, and again, if they have a point system for like building units, then that would be helpful for at least maintaining balance. But otherwise, you're going to have to kind of develop your own milieu to ground your game and say, well, it's possible to do this, but you can't put like this many lasers on like a tank because that doesn't make sense. You know,
you do need to apply, if not the logic of another setting you're adapting this to, you need to apply your own logic then to have some degree of, I guess what I'm trying to say is have some degree of verisimilitude and have your units hold up. You know, is you need to have a certain internal logic and consistency that if you don't have it, maybe look at a setting and use that. I just looked at the Legion Imperialis tanks and vehicles and tried to think of like early epic games and balance them around that, you know, not like what is their current meta status. And it's like, no. Just, okay, what's a Predator battle tank like? Okay, he's got a cannon that fires shells, so it's like an explosion. He's got bolters on the side. Cool. Let's just roll with that. And it created some units lickety-split. Wasn't that complicated. And I did a test game. Again, I've played it numerous times throughout its years since release, but I just played another one just to refresh myself. And I think I will be playing some more after that. However, I found that the quick whip up of units I did was really good. It wasn't hard at all. You just look at the sample values it gives you, and then you try and think of that as a scale for a weight class. Like they'll say like a medium tank is between a 3 to a 6 armor class, we'll say, or armor value. And you just look at your tank and you're like, okay, if it's between 3 to 6, what am I? Am I the lowest end of that? Am I the top part of that? You know, how heavy do these little plates look on my guy? You know, and that process just by eyeball produced my Predator battle tanks and my Lehman Russ battle tanks, who slugged it out and had an awesome fight. It led to a cool traffic jam sequence, where the lead tank got knocked out, and it was really cool. It worked very satisfyingly. And that's, again, an advantage of Quadrant 13, is that it gives really plausible, grounded outcomes in sort of a more of a hard sci-fi capacity, because it's not a game where one character is going to roll a flank,
I think that sort of plays to the idea about why it's so grounded, to like why you were pointing out the fact that it seems very based in reality, because it really has nothing else to anchor itself unless you build something else to anchor it.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I'd be interested to kind of get a better sense of it, because I'm often on the hunt for something like a hard SF rule set or something that plays well in that concept. It's not incredibly popular as an idea. Like, again, I enjoy BattleTech, so that kind of fills a bit of that niche. But it's also based around the idea of having giant fighting robots.
Right. Well, okay, hard sci-fi gets a tough rap because people have to you have to engage with it at a different level than sci-fantasy or pulp science fiction, right?
For sure.
And I think it's cool that Quadrant 13 is sort of rooted in these, I guess I'll put it, in these sort of grounded notions, these base principles that allow you to experiment with things and get cool outcomes. It's like a simulation for testing out these sci-fi force concepts, So if you want to dial in like a cool sci-fi force, it's just a couple games away, for you to reach that point of like, no, I now understand how many lasers a tank should have.
There's some trial and error as to figuring out what feels correct. I actually have two interesting questions because you're familiar with like a lot of the game lines, TooFatLardies.
Yeah.
Are the rules in this reasonably backwards compatible with its sister systems?
There are some distinctions between I Ain't Been Shot and Charlie Don't Surf. The fire table in this game is very different. It's still the exact same roll your D6s on the table, and add up and look at
the values are different. Yeah.
The values are totally different because you're using like laser carbines, as opposed to like a Garand. So it's going to make a difference. The operational blocks that make up this game, the way you draw the cards, even what the cards are about, like the special cards that can also be mixed in the deck that trigger unit abilities, we'll call them, even those are just echoes of what's in the other games. So there is a certain amount of idea sharing that's happening here, and that could be explored even more so. So where this game makes the statement that like, oh, we are doing armed force on armed force, if you were to take Charlie Don't Surf as your inspiration point, you could absolutely backport that into this to create more of a counterinsurgency flair to a sci-fi experience.
Yeah, so that's what I mean, is that if, depending on what elements of each rule set that you use and combine, you could create a kind of grounding if you wanted to create a particular... So if, say, you wanted that more asymmetrical style warfare that's in Charlie Don't Surf, you could bring in some of those elements with not too much tweaking or tuning.
You're absolutely right. And same with I Ain't Been Shot. Like, if you were to play Quar in this game, as is possible, there's even Quar photos in the rule book. You know how I love those little dudes. You could just look at I Ain't Been Shot, and anything that this rulebook doesn't specifically cover that feels very appropriately 20th century conflict, well, you could just rip right out of that game and plug it into this one. You could even use this as a guide to come up with units that you then squeeze and fit into the unit roles of I Ain't Been Shot. So you're still using I Ain't Been Shot as the core skeletal rule set, which has a few distinctions from this game, like especially in artillery and stuff. You would still use that with units that you effectively design with considerations from Quadrant 13. There is a lot of shared DNA, and I think that's very cool. I think this game's best opportunity is when you want to apply a campaign system over top of it that's a very non-mechanical campaign system, one that's very loose and open-ended, not in a particularly like abstract heavy way, but more in like a Kriegspiel capacity where it's like, where do my 100 men go? They go where I tell them. They don't go to hex A3, or maybe they do, but it depends how you want to rationalize it. But it's more important that they're at the farmhouse than it is that they're in hex A3, right? It's more literal on the map.
Landmark oriented, kind of.
Yeah, and I feel like this game, with that type of campaign map, played out where it's like, what is my army list this time? It's whatever is in the campaign that's putting me there. I've moved my units on the map, and that's what I have. It's not as much about notions of balance or strict symmetry in your force. Like we talked about asymmetry in terms of like force background, but what about forces on the table? Well, that's something that's kind of inherent to this game because the points only came later in a Lardies special. They weren't integral to the game itself. So there was a lot of asymmetry in my early games because I was dialing in like what it meant to have a tank that had, a higher strike value cannon, right? And that like led to some fights where it was like, oh wow, these guys are undergunned or overgunned or whatever might have been the outcome. But to dial it back, I think this could do a lot of different settings and a lot of different work. I'm getting it to do my epic gaming right now. I've used Laser Storm and had a blast with that, but right now I'm using Quadrant 13 for a more intimate and intense look at things. But Max, I want to turn it around and ask you, like, when you're given something like this, like a simulative hard sci-fi combat engine, what do you want to use it for?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. You probably for something that like I've created myself. That kind of science fiction as taken from some other source. Those sources are I find hard sci-fi as a theme in, say, stories tends to be very thematically driven, I think for the sake of focus. And so it's very hard to translate into a broad war game thing. I think one thing that might be interesting if you wanted to use it as a sort of backdrop would be something like Foundation.
Ooh, that would be super cool. Yeah.
Even though not much is said about the military forces, but I think that's sort of my point, right? Like you could use the rise and fall of the Foundation through the novels as being kind of like a very big meta arc that you could play with.
Great campaign fodder in there. I do think this game also, in a way, could do Dune in a way that so many other things could not do it.
That's a good point. And that's actually very similar to Foundation, at least in that sense. And there is more of a consideration of military forces in Dune. Yeah, I could see that for sure.
Close combat can be very important in this game. Firepower is key, though. So if you can't get there, it doesn't matter if you have close combat. So you need mobility, as well as you can't just be like, oh, I have 2 chainswords in my hand. You can't do that. You need some way to project force outside of your immediate 1 meter circle. You know what I mean? Because the other guy can project force probably out to 500 meters, and he's going to smoke you. So you gotta think about that. But troops that are heavily melee oriented with shields on to protect them from incoming ranged fire, that's entirely possible in this rule set. So you could easily do like the house guard that fights to the end on Dune, you know what I mean? For you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. The one thing you need to kind of weigh in for, though, is the fact that if someone uses a las cannon on a shield, then fight's over.
Yeah, right. You've ended the game.
Yeah, this particular battle is finished.
That's hilarious. But I feel like there's a lot of, like, even if you wanted to do this, like, and I don't know if this is heresy or not, but even if you wanted to do more of an infantry and support vehicle focused Battletech fight, that would work really well here.
Sure, yeah. Well, I was thinking about that, and I've been toying around with trying out a purely infantry-based Battletech scenario, just so I can see how more of those mechanics work with each other. But if you wanted something that was probably a little less tightly played, not necessarily on a hex grid, because effectively what I surmise playing an infantry-based Battletech game is going to feel a lot like Advanced Squad Leader, but with less specific rules.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, it'll be a lot more like an ASL where everyone moves a little slower, and because the ground scale's zoomed out for the vehicle focus. But like, yeah, that would be really cool.
Yeah, it might bring up the pace a bit and make some of the decision making a bit more interesting using Quadrant 13 instead of just the base like BattleTech Classic system.
And another element we should mention quickly about Quadrant 13 is it's a blinds game as well. To clarify what that means is blinds are templates that you put on the table that represent troops that have not otherwise been identified by the opposing force. So they're usually between 4 to 6 inches wide, 3 to 5 inches deep, and you would put them on the table instead of putting your troops down. In Quadrant 13, that's a whole platoon usually. So sometimes it can be less, but typically it's like one platoon of 3 squads or 3 vehicles, right? And they're one of this template. And this template moves around at the start of the game because that's what you'll deploy on in many cases. And then once they're spotted through spotting rules, which is another action, just another way to spend those dice of yours, that will have them convert from that card or from that template into the specific dudes that they are. And then you deploy them in contact with where that template was. That leads to a lot of hidden information, double bluffing, and there are false blinds. These are blinds that convert to nothing. When they're spotted, they just disappear because they represent radio interference, false blips on the scanner, or even scouting parties, or like 2-man sniper teams that are getting the eye on things, right? So that is a whole other way in which this game creates a certain tension and reality, because you're not just deploying across a baseline and you're like, okay, that's where the heavy tanks are. I got to blow that up on turn 1. It's like, okay, there's a bunch of templates over there. One of those is the heavy tanks. I wonder what one. I wonder where. It creates this interesting focus on being able to gain intelligence and spot as much as wanting to just drive your best unit forward to blow stuff up.
Yeah. It's sort of like an alternate take on what jump off markers are like.
Yeah, it is. It's like everyone is their own jump off marker now, instead of there being fixed ones that are like for the whole force. It's like everyone kind of is their own one. You get to spot from being one of these blinds. The blinds move by rolling the dice, just like we described for infantry and vehicles. So it's very similar. They operate on the same principles. It's just they can't shoot. If you do want to shoot, you just remove the blind, deploy the troops, and then fire with whatever action dice you have left. So you can do that for sure. But otherwise, you're just moving this blind around. Importantly, blinds cannot receive orders from big men on table. So they are sort of in the wing, as it were. Like they're not fully committed yet. But once they're deployed on table, unless there's very specific types of units, there's no going back onto blinds. Only irregulars or the lightest of recon units can do that.
Gotcha.
Now, in terms of the way the game plays, is it gives you 8 scenarios in the back of the book. They walk you through fighting what is sort of like it's not really a fair fight because it's not intended to be. There's scenarios. So you'll get the prepared scenario where the attacker has 3 core platoons of infantry and 3 supporting platoons, where the defender is 2 and 3 themselves, 2 core platoons and 3 supporting platoons. So they're inherently imbalanced, but the attacker is given very specific jobs, like you have 2 objectives in the middle and in the rear of the table. Get each of those to win, or get one of them for a minor victory. So the defender doesn't have the same ask. It's more that they're spoiling the plans of the attacker, so they get less to work with. It's kind of that old 3-to-1 attacker odds ratio, but it's the gamer version, which is more like 1.5 to 1. There's 8 of these scenarios. They range from the prepared attack and the hasty attack, which are sort of your conventional, a company is punching another company in the stomach. They go all the way through to flank attack, to breakthrough, so you get some more maneuver-oriented maps. And these don't give you point values again. They're just telling you the number of building blocks you can take, and whatever you make those building blocks out of, that's on you. If you made all of your stuff the deluxe heavy infantry with the deluxe heavy tanks, and your opponent just made a regular list, well, that could go a predictable way. However, the fun part of this is really defining a list that matches your collection, that's really cool, feels especially representative of even the little parts, because this game can get in there and be the little parts. And then you fight out not just a punch up or a dust up, but like an actual real feels like a fight. And that's what I love about a company fight, because when I look at a platoon level game, even if there are multiple objectives on the board, very often platoon level games are about a singular focal point. You know, the action focuses on one point. But what I find with company level games and beyond company, like to Battalion Plus, is you start to have multiple focal points. And that's where I get really satisfied, is where I have to manage my assets and resources between these competing fires that are burning. And it's like, where do I put what I have into these different fires? You know what I'm saying? And I find company level gaming is where that starts to get really satisfying. Platoon level games can have you like put a squad on the flank to cover the farm, and I'm going to go for the main manor house. Like there is that division of force, but everything is so tight that it's not as pronounced. Where in a company level game, in the demo game I ran for myself, I had a fight going down a highway, and then there was a big skyscraper, and to get to the skyscraper, we went down the highway and through the hedge line that was sort of adjacent to town. And it led to two distinct important fights that were both culminating with the capture of the tower. But they were in their own right unique and required different resources and different timing and had different participants in them. And it felt like you couldn't have had one without the other. You know, you couldn't just like play them as two separate platoon level engagements, because there was crossover, you know, where like one unit wasn't under fire this turn from the left, so they fire on the right, you know, stuff like that. But it was in that you got to see the joy of a company level game, where it's like, ooh, there's meat here. There's more than one place that your mind will be forced to make decisions upon.
Oh yeah, for sure. No, that is an interesting point. And yeah, having to put out multiple fires is much more of an interesting situation to be in, especially if it has that like that varied resolutional system that could also slow the game down. But again, when we were talking in the previous episode, just because a game slows down or requires more like individual resolutions doesn't make that experience less enjoyable, as long as you know what you're getting into.
Exactly.
Now, an interesting question that I have before we finish up, like, they have recommended scales for models. I think it's 10 and 15 or somewhere in that range.
6 to 15. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Oh, yeah. So they do mention, because I was curious if they have it as small as 6.
The way that I Ain't Been Shot's always been balanced in terms of ground scale is that 15 mil looks good, 6 mil is accurate. Just like how Chain is 28 mil looks good, 15 mil is accurate. It's exactly the same logic for I Ain't Been Shot.
Okay. Yeah, because I didn't see the 6 mil in there, but I definitely saw at the beginning they had a recommendation of 15 to 10, and I can see that making a lot of sense for the scale. But you're right. I think that going as far as like a 6 mil game, and 6 mil sci-fi is just because of the nature of science fiction warfare as it's usually depicted or extrapolated from modern warfare. That scale makes more sense. I wish there were more lines of 6 mil sci-fi. I mean, that's the thing, is there are actually quite a few lines of 6 mil sci-fi. I just wish there were more. I wish it were a more popular scale.
I wish there were more plastics available in these different scales, especially 15 plastics are so rare. I would love more of that. But it's really interesting how like the different scales will make the game feel a little different. Like if you want it to feel more close up and you want to play with like maybe less platoons overall, 15 mil will be great, and you'll never bat an eye. If you want to maybe squeeze some extra armor onto the table and really go for a grand sweep, 6 mil will be exactly what you want. You know, and the new Epic stuff from GW and from Mantic, you know, it's right in like an 8 to 10 mil range, which is very comfortable in this scale. And a lot of those games, you're basing 5 guys on a 25 millimeter circle. So 2 of those, so 2 25 mil round bases with your 10 men on them, your 10 little soldiermen, that's a squad. That's your base element. And that's like, you can paint that in the blink of an eye. You don't need so many that, I mean, if you want to play other games or really like do multi-company offensives, maybe you'll need a lot of them. But for just what Quadrant 13 wants from you, you don't need that many. So it's pretty easy to get this game rolling. I think the hardest part is definitely getting the list done at the start, especially when you're new to the game and you don't really know what anything means. You know, when you're like, well, what's the difference between strike value 5 and strike value 7? I'll give him 7, and then you're smoking everything. And you're like, whoa, should I have not done that? And that's 2 points on that. 1, your eye will get better at that over time. And 2, playtesting is fun.
Exactly. Yeah. So, all right. Yeah, I mean, I think we've covered at least the broad strokes. It's a very deep game, and I think any more than that, and we would not be, like, you really have to play this kind of a thing to get your head around it.
Yeah, it's worth giving a try to, especially if you're a sci-fi gamer who has like an epic scale collection and that you don't regularly know what to use on. You know, if you're like, oh man, what would be fun to jam on this? We've had some examples on the show in the past, but I think this is a great one for something that's a little more sharp, crunchy, and literal.
Yeah, I think you could play it a lot of different ways. They have a lot of additional rules and systems that you can put into it. It sounds like something I would enjoy. And yeah, your recommendation for how to use it or how I might want to use it.
Might be the only miniatures game that has time travel rules. Just saying.
Yeah, fair point. So there you go. That is Quadrant 13. Next week's episode, we are covering an interesting concept that I think probably applies more to RPGs than wargames, but we're going to try and cover its equivalent in wargaming, which is the concept of Rule 0. And if you don't know what that is, tune in and you'll find out. All right. Well, until then, all of you have a great week and happy gaming.
Happy gaming.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.